Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The GPS kept recalculating, and recalculating, and recalculating. The automated voice had given up trying to pronounce my street name 20 minutes ago. Now, it just said turn left onto unnamed road, in that eerily calm tone that made my skin crawl. You know what's funny? I've lived at 447 Willow Bend Court for 3 years, but according to every map service, delivery app, and government database, my house shouldn't exist, and after what I discovered last Tuesday, I'm starting to understand why. But before I tell you what happened, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some places just feel wrong? Like the universe forgot to finish coding that particular spot? Well, that's my entire neighborhood. And if you're listening to this late at night, wrapped up in your blankets, thinking you're safe, I need you to know something. Safety is just an illusion we tell ourselves. Because the truth is, some addresses aren't meant to be found. Some houses aren't meant to be lived in. And some stories, well, they're not meant to have happy endings. So get comfortable, but not too comfortable, because this story, my story, it starts now. Tuesday started like any other day. Coffee at 7 a.m., emails by 8, and by noon I was starving. I opened DoorDash, ordered my usual chicken Caesar wrap from Tony's Deli, and settled in to wait. The app said 35 minutes. Perfect. 45 minutes passed, then an hour. I checked the app, and there it was. That familiar message that made my stomach drop every single time. Driver cannot locate address. I sighed and called the driver. His name was Marcus. I remember because he sounded genuinely confused, not just lazy or frustrated like some of them get. "Ma'am, I'm literally driving in circles," he said, and I could hear the bewilderment in his voice. "I'm at the corner of Oak and Main like the app says, but there's no Willow Bend Court here, just trees." "Take a left at the old gas station," I told him, giving the same directions I'd given 100 times before. "The one with the faded Texaco sign, then count 3 streets and turn right." "There's no gas station here," Marcus insisted. "I've lived in Burlington my whole life. There's never been a gas station on Oak Street." My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. "What do you mean? It's been there since the 50s. My neighbor Ruth told me she used to get penny candy there as a kid." Silence on the other end. Then, "Ma'am, are you sure you gave me the right address?" I rattled it off again. 447 Willow Bend Court, Burlington, Vermont, 05401. But even as I said it, something felt off. Like the words were fighting their way out of my mouth. "That zip code," Marcus said slowly. "Burlington is 0542. There is no 0541. The mug slipped from my hand, crashed onto the kitchen floor. Brown liquid spreading across the white tiles like blood. Because I'd been writing that zip code for 3 years. It was on all my mail, my driver's license, everything. Just cancel the order," I whispered, and hung up. I spent the next hour on Google Maps, Apple Maps, even pulled out an old paper map from my glove compartment. My street wasn't on any of them, not one. The area where my neighborhood should be was just green, empty space, forest. But I could see my house, I could touch the walls. My neighbors waved when they walked their dogs past my window. This was real, wasn't it? That's when I decided to talk to Ruth. Ruth Henderson had lived next door since before I moved in. 73 years old, sharp as a tack, always had fresh cookies and 20-minute stories about the way things used to be. But when I knocked on her door that Tuesday afternoon, something was different. She opened the door just a crack, peering out with one watery blue eye. "Sarah? What are you doing here?" I I live next door, Ruth. I wanted to ask you about the neighborhood." Her face went pale. Actually pale, like all the blood just drained right out. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "None of us should be here." "Ruth, what are you talking about?" She glanced behind her, then stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind her. "How long have you lived here, Sarah?" 3 years. You know that. You brought me brownies my first week." She shook her head slowly. No, that's not right. Time doesn't work right here. I've been here since 1952, but sometimes I wake up and it's still 1952. Sometimes I look in the mirror and I'm 25 again. Sometimes..." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Sometimes I remember dying in 1987, heart attack in my kitchen, but I'm still here." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. "Ruth, that doesn't make any sense. Nothing here makes sense." She grabbed my arm, her fingers like ice through my sweater. "Haven't you noticed? When was the last time you left? Really left? Drove out of the neighborhood and went somewhere else?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't remember. I worked from home, ordered everything online. When was the last time I'd actually driven past the neighborhood entrance? "The pizza boy last month," I said finally. "He found the house, delivered my order." Ruth's laugh was bitter. "Did he? Or did you just think he did? Tell me, Sarah, what did he look like?" I tried to picture him, but it was like trying to remember a dream. Fuzzy, indistinct. Had there even been a pizza boy? "I need to go," I said, backing away. "We all need to go," Ruth called after me. "But we can't, we never can. Because this place, it's not on any map for a reason. Maps are for places that exist, and we..." She laughed again, high and broken. "We're something else entirely." I ran back to my house, locked the door, and tried to convince myself Ruth was having some kind of episode. Dementia, maybe. But my hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called my sister in Chicago. "The number you have dialed is not in service." I tried my mother, my best friend from college, my ex-boyfriend. Every single number. The same message. I checked my phone bill online. 3 years of payments, but no call history. Not one single call. That's when I noticed something else. My Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all active, all full of posts, but no interactions, no likes, no comments. Just me, posting into the void for 3 years. I was halfway through a panic attack when I heard it. A sound I'd never heard before in this neighborhood. A car engine. Getting closer, someone was coming. The car was a black sedan, government plates, tinted windows. It parked right in front of my house, engine still running. I watched from behind my living room curtains as a woman got out. Tall, wearing a crisp black suit despite the heat, carrying a manila folder. She walked straight to my door and knocked, not rang the bell. Knocked 3 times. Deliberate. I didn't want to answer, but something made me, like my body was moving without my permission. I opened the door. "Sarah Chen?" Her voice was flat, professional, but there was something underneath it. Pity, maybe, or fear. "How do you know my name? How did you find this place?" She held up the folder. "We need to talk. May I come in?" I should have said no, should have slammed the door, but I stepped aside and let her in. She sat on my couch like she'd been there before, opened the folder, and spread out newspaper clippings on my coffee table. "Local woman dies in car accident." The headline from the Burlington Free Press, dated 3 years ago. My picture stared back at me from the yellowed paper. "No," I whispered. "No, that's not... I'm right here. I'm talking to you." "Are you?" She pulled out another clipping. 27 die in Willow Bend court fire. This one was older. 1987. Ruth Henderson's name was on the list of victims. Another clipping. 1962. Gas explosion levels neighborhood. Another. 1943. Mysterious disappearances plague new development. Every 20 to 25 years, the woman said calmly, something happens here. And every time the victims don't leave. They just continue, living in houses that were destroyed, walking streets that were never rebuilt, existing in a neighborhood that the city erased from every record, every map, every memory. That's insane, is it? When was the last time you ate, Sarah? Really ate? When was the last time you felt hungry, or tired, or cold? I started to argue, then stopped, because I couldn't remember. The chicken wrap I'd ordered. Had I actually wanted it, or was it just routine, going through the motions? What are you? I asked. I'm from the Department of Cartographic Anomalies, she said, which wasn't an answer at all. We monitor places like this. Places that shouldn't exist but do, or places that should exist but don't. Your neighborhood falls into both categories. So, what happens now? Do you exorcise us or something? She almost smiled. We can't force you to leave. The binding doesn't work that way. You have to choose. But Sarah, she leaned forward, the longer you stay, the less of you remains. You're not dead, but you're not alive either. You're stuck in between. And eventually, even the memory of who you were fades. You become just another ghost, going through the motions, ordering food that never comes, calling numbers that don't exist, posting on social media that no one sees. But I feel real, I insisted. I have memories, a job, a life. Do you? Or do you have the echo of those things? Tell me about your job, Sarah. What project are you working on right now? I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. I knew I worked. I sat at my computer every day. But what did I actually do? Who did I work for? The details were smoke. The accident, I said finally. Tell me about the accident. She pulled out the last document from her folder. A police report. You were driving home from a job interview, company called Technova. Ring any bells? Technova, yes. Yes, I remembered. Downtown Burlington. They'd offered me the position on the spot. Senior developer, exactly what I'd been looking for. I'd been so excited, driving too fast. The rain had just started. The turn onto Oak Street. There was a truck, I whispered. It ran the red light. You died on impact, she said gently, but instead of moving on, you came here, to the place between. Some people call it purgatory, others call it a glitch in reality. We just call it Willow Bend Court. How do I leave? You have to want to. Really want to. Not just say it, but accept it. Accept what happened. Accept that this, she gestured around my living room. This isn't real, it's a comfort. A lie you tell yourself because the truth is too hard. I looked around my house. My beautiful house that I'd loved from the moment I saw it. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. The kitchen with the window that looked out onto the garden. The garden I'd planted but never seen bloom, because it was always just about to bloom. Always just about to. The others, I said. Ruth, my other neighbors. How long have they been here? Time works differently in places like this. Ruth has been here for 37 years, but she's lived the same day roughly 13,000 times. Mr. Peterson across the street, 52 years. The Yamamoto family at the end of the cul-de-sac. They don't even remember their real names anymore. And if I stay, then in another 20 years or so, something will happen. Another accident, another tragedy, and more people will join you. The neighborhood will grow. The addresses that don't exist will multiply, and you'll welcome them with brownies and small talk, never quite remembering that you're all just shadows playing house in a place that was erased from every map for a reason. She stood up, gathered her papers, left one business card on the table. It was blank except for a phone number. "When you're ready," she said. "Really ready. Call this number. Someone will come. Someone will help you move on. But Sarah?" She paused at the door. "Don't wait too long. The forgetting, it's merciful in its own way, but it's still forgetting. And you were someone once. Someone who deserved to be remembered." After she left, I sat in my living room for hours, or maybe minutes, or maybe days. Time doesn't work right here. Ruth was right about that. I thought about my life, my real life, the interview at Tech Nova, the excitement, the rain, the truck, the moment when everything stopped. And I thought about this life, this strange half-life in a neighborhood that doesn't exist. Safe, comfortable, predictable, empty. I picked up the business card. I stood there holding that business card for what felt like hours. The numbers on it seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, like they were trying to hide from me. Or maybe I was trying to hide from them. I walked to my kitchen window. Outside, the neighborhood looked so perfect, so normal. Mrs. Patterson was walking her golden retriever, the one that never barked, never needed a leash. Never? I squinted, never left footprints in the grass. My hands were shaking now. When had I last seen rain here? Real rain that left puddles, that made the ground muddy, that required umbrellas? The weather was always perfect, always 72 degrees, always partly cloudy with a gentle breeze. "Stop it," I told myself. "You're overthinking this." But was I? I opened my refrigerator, full of food, fresh vegetables, milk with next week's expiration date, leftover Chinese from when? I couldn't remember ordering Chinese, I couldn't remember eating it, but there it was. In the same container it always was. Always. I picked up the container, opened it, chicken lo mein. It looked fresh, smelled fresh, but when I tried to remember the taste, nothing. Just like when I tried to remember the last time I was actually hungry, or thirsty, or tired. The business card felt warm in my hand, getting warmer. I walked to my bedroom. My bed was perfectly made. Had I slept in it last night? The sheets were crisp, hospital corners, not a wrinkle. I tried to mess them up, pulled at the comforter, but when I blinked, they were perfect again. My closet was full of clothes I didn't remember buying, clothes that never got dirty, that never wore out, that always fit perfectly even though I couldn't remember the last time I'd checked my weight or looked in a mirror and really seen myself. The mirror. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and really looked, really concentrated, and for just a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, I saw through myself. Saw the cracked tiles behind me, the broken fixtures, the mold growing on walls that had been burned black decades ago. No, I blinked hard. The bathroom was pristine again. White tiles, chrome fixtures, that lavender soap I loved but couldn't remember buying. The business card was burning now. Not painful, but insistent. Like it was alive, like it wanted to be used. I went back downstairs. Sat on my couch. The TV was on. Had it always been on? The same show playing, the same episode. The one where the detective figures out the killer, but I could never quite remember who it was or why they did it. The ending always fuzzy, always just out of reach. My photo albums were on the coffee table. When had I taken them out? I opened one. Pictures of me. But wrong. My face was there, but the backgrounds were all hazy, like someone had photoshopped me into stock photos. Here I was at the Grand Canyon, but I couldn't remember the heat or the vastness or the way my legs ached after hiking. Here I was at my college graduation, but I couldn't name a single classmate or professor, or even what I'd studied. The last page had one photo, me in a car, smiling, wearing interview clothes. There was rain on the windshield and I was holding up a piece of paper, a job offer from Technova. The memory hit me like ice water. The interview, the nervous energy, the project manager who'd been impressed by my portfolio, the salary that would finally let me stop worrying about student loans, the rain that started just as I left their building, the excitement that made me drive just a little too fast, the yellow light that I thought I could make, the truck that thought the same thing, the sound of metal on metal, the spin, the tree, the choice. I'd been given a choice, hadn't I? In those final moments. A voice, warm and patient, asking if I was ready, and I'd said no, said I wasn't done, said I had so much left to do. So I'd ended up here, in the place for people who weren't ready, who couldn't let go, who chose the illusion of life over the reality of death. The business card was practically vibrating now. I stood up, walked outside, really looked at my neighbors. Ruth was in her window. Had she been standing there for 3 years? 50 years? Her face was pale, translucent, her eyes empty, watching nothing, waiting for nothing. Mr. Peterson's car washing was mechanical, the same motions, the same sections, over and over. His mouth was moving. Was he singing? Or just opening and closing it because that's what mouths do? The Yamamoto children on their swings, back and forth, never laughing, never calling to each other, just the motion, endless, automatic. And me? What did I do all day? Sit at a computer pretending to work, order food that never came, watch shows that never ended, call people who didn't exist? Was this hell, or just nothing? A waiting room between life and whatever comes next, a place for cowards who couldn't face the truth. The business card was so hot now I could barely hold it, but I gripped it tighter, made myself feel it, because it was the first real thing I'd felt in 3 years. The number took forever to dial. Each digit felt heavier than the last, like the phone itself was trying to stop me. When it finally rang, the sound was distant, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere very far away. Department of Cartographic Anomalies. Different voice, male this time, older. My throat felt dry. I want to leave. Address? 447 Willow Bend Court. Silence. Then, are you sure? Once you begin the process, you can't change your mind. The comfort of that place. It won't call to you anymore. You'll have to face what comes next, whatever that is. I looked out my window. Ruth was in her garden, watering flowers that never grew. Mr. Peterson was washing a car that never got dirty. The Yamamoto children were playing on swings that never squeaked, never needed oil, never aged. I'm sure. Look outside again, Sarah. Tell me what you really see. I looked, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw. Ruth's garden was a patch of scorched earth. Her house was a blackened skeleton of beams and ash. Mr. Peterson's car was a rusted heap, windows shattered, tires rotted away. The Yamamoto's swing set was twisted metal, wrapped around a tree that had grown through it decades ago. And my house, I turned around slowly. The walls were fading, becoming transparent. I could see through them to the empty lot beyond. The furniture was dissolving like sugar in rain, the photos on the walls, blank. They'd always been blank. I see the truth, I whispered. Then close your eyes, Sarah, and let go. I closed my eyes, and I remembered everything. Not just the accident, but after, the moment of choice, the pull of the light, warm and welcoming, and the fear that made me turn away, made me run, made me hide in this place that wasn't a place. "I don't want to forget who I was," I said. "You won't. The forgetting only happens if you stay. If you go, you take yourself with you, all of it, the good and the bad, the life you lived and the death that ended it. That's the trade. Truth for comfort, reality for illusion. Which do you choose?" I thought about my parents, my sister, my friends. Did they mourn me? Did they move on? 3 years. Had they forgotten my face? My laugh? The way I took my coffee? "I choose truth," I said, and meant it. The phone dissolved in my hand. The floor beneath my feet became mist, and I was falling, or flying, or both. Behind me, I heard Ruth calling my name. But it wasn't my name anymore. It had never been my name. Because Sarah Chen died on Oak Street 3 years ago. And ghosts don't have names. I opened my eyes, and I'm still opening them. Every day, every moment. Because that's the thing about places that don't exist on any map. You can leave them, but they never quite leave you. The transition wasn't instant. That's what they don't tell you about letting go. It's not like flipping a switch, it's like defrosting, slow, painful. Every sensation returning bit by bit. First came temperature, real cold. Not the artificial perfection of Willowbend Court, but actual, bone-deep cold. Then heat, searing, overwhelming. My body remembering what it meant to feel. Then came hunger. God, the hunger. 3 years of not eating. Suddenly crashing down on me all at once, and thirst, and exhaustion. Every human need I'd ignored, pretended didn't exist, flooding back like a dam bursting. But worst of all was the memory. Not just of the accident, but of everything I'd missed. 3 years of my parents aging, 3 years of my sister's life. Did she get married, have kids? 3 years of the world moving on without me while I played house in a neighborhood that didn't exist. The guilt was suffocating. I'd chosen comfort over truth, chosen the easy lie over the hard reality. And for what? To pretend everything was fine? To avoid facing my own mortality? But here's the thing about guilt. It means you're alive, or at least, real. Because the dead don't feel guilty. They don't feel anything. They just exist, or don't exist. Depends on your perspective, I guess. I don't know where I am now. It's bright here, warm, but different from Willowbend Court. Real in a way that place never was. Sometimes I catch glimpses of others, people who made the same choice I did, people who chose truth over comfort. We don't talk much. What would we say? Hey, I also spent decades in denial about being dead. But sometimes we nod at each other. A recognition. A shared understanding. We're the ones who almost got stuck, the ones who nearly became permanent residents of nowhere. There's a woman here. She says she was in Willowbend Court for 90 years. 90 years. She showed up after the original fire in 1932, the one that started it all. A cigarette left burning. 23 people died. But some of them, they just couldn't accept it. So they stayed. Built their ghost neighborhood on the ashes of the real one. She says the place feeds on denial. Gets stronger with every soul that refuses to move on. That's why it keeps growing. Why the addresses multiply, why the maps can't find it. Because it exists in the gap between what is and what we wish was true. And it's not the only one. Every city has them, every town. Sometimes it's a whole neighborhood like Willowbend Court. Sometimes it's just a single house. That one on your street that's always for sale but never sells. The apartment building where the lights flicker but no one ever seems to move in or out. The cul-de-sac that GPS can never quite locate. They're gathering places for the lost, the stubborn, the afraid. And once you're in, once you've accepted the illusion, it takes something extraordinary to break free. But sometimes, late at night, or what passes for night here, I can still see it. That neighborhood that never was. Still there, still waiting. New houses appearing as new residents arrive. The addresses multiplying, spreading, like a cancer on reality's skin. And I know, with a certainty that chills whatever I am now, that it's growing. Every city has them. These holes in the map, these places where the lost go to forget they're lost. Maybe you've driven past one. Maybe you've felt that wrongness, that sense that something shouldn't be there. Trust that feeling. Drive faster. Don't look back. Because once you turn onto a street that doesn't exist, once you accept a comfort that isn't real, it's so very, very hard to leave. The woman in the black suit was wrong about one thing, though. The forgetting isn't merciful, it's a trap. Because as long as you forget, you can't grow, can't change, can't move on. You're stuck in amber, preserved but not alive, forever ordering food that won't come to an address that doesn't exist. So let me ask you something, and think carefully before you answer. Do you remember how you got to where you are right now? Do you remember the last time you left your neighborhood? Really left? Do your delivery drivers always seem confused? Does your mail carrier never quite look you in the eye? Check your maps, all of them. See if your address appears, and if it doesn't, well, now you know the number to call. It's probably still in your pocket, on a blank business card that shouldn't exist, from a department that isn't in any government directory. But whether you call it or not, that's up to you. Some people prefer the comfort of nowhere to the uncertainty of somewhere. Some people would rather be forgotten than remembered. Some people, well, some people are already more ghost than human. And for them, Willow Bend Court is paradise. Just remember, maps exist for a reason. They tell us where we are, where we're going, where we've been. But more importantly, they tell us what's real. And if your address isn't on any map, if your street doesn't exist in any database, if your zip code returns an error every single time, then maybe, just maybe, neither do you. Sweet dreams, if you can still dream, and if you're listening to this late at night, all alone, wondering why that last part made your skin crawl, check your maps, right now. Pull out your phone and search for your address. Go ahead, I'll wait. Still there? Good, you're one of the lucky ones. But if you're not, if you're sitting in a house that shouldn't exist on a street that was never built in a neighborhood that was erased, well, at least now you know why. But here's something else to consider. Something that keeps me, whatever I am now, awake at night. Or what passes for night. What if it's not just neighborhoods? What if there are whole towns that don't exist? Cities even. Have you ever driven through a place that felt wrong? Where the people moved just a little too slowly? Where the stores were open but no one was shopping? Where the traffic lights changed but no cars moved? Maybe you stopped for gas. Maybe you bought a soda from a machine that looked older than it should. Maybe you asked for directions and got that blank stare. That pause before they answered. Like they were trying to remember how to be human. You probably drove away fast. Probably forgot about it by the next town. But what if you hadn't? What if you'd taken that turn they suggested? Followed that road that wasn't on your GPS? What if you'd decided to stay the night in that motel with too many vacancies and a clerk who never blinked? Would you have ever left? Or would you be there still, going through the motions? Forgetting who you were, becoming part of the scenery in a place that only exists because people believe it does? The real question is, what are you going to do about it? Because somewhere out there, in a place between places, Ruth is still watering her garden of ash. Mr. Peterson is still washing his rusted ghost of a car. The Yamamoto children are still playing on swings that burned down before they were born. And there's always room for one more, in the neighborhood that doesn't exist, at an address that's not on any map. The choice, as they say, is yours, but choose quickly, because the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to remember that you even have a choice at all. And trust me, I would know. Story number 2. The elevator in my apartment building stops at 12, then jumps straight to 14. I used to think it was just superstition. Old buildings in Chicago do that sometimes, skip the 13th floor to avoid bad luck. But last Tuesday, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I found out why we really don't talk about it anymore. If you're listening to this late at night, maybe check that your elevator doesn't have a button that wasn't there before. Because once you see it, once you press it, there's no going back. And now, our story begins. I'd lived in the Grandview Apartments for 3 years without incident. It's one of those pre-war buildings in Lincoln Park. You know the type. Red brick exterior, ornate lobby with marble floors that echo every footstep, and that old-fashioned cage elevator with the brass accordion gate. The kind of place that whispers stories if you listen close enough. My insomnia had been getting worse that autumn. Work stress, probably. I was pulling 12-hour days at the accounting firm downtown. That particular Tuesday started like any other sleepless night. I'd given up on bed around 3 in the morning and decided to head down to the 24-hour convenience store on Clark Street for some chamomile tea. The hallway was tomb quiet. Just the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the city bleeding through old windows. I pressed the elevator call button and waited, listening to the cables groan as the car descended from somewhere above. When the doors slid open, I stepped inside and reached for the lobby button. That's when I saw it. Between buttons 12 and 14, where there had always been a smooth brass plate, was a button I'd never noticed before. The number 13, slightly tarnished, like it had been hidden under that plate for decades. My finger hovered over it, trembling slightly. How had I never seen this before? The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Maybe maintenance had been working on the elevator. Maybe they'd finally decided to acknowledge the floor that we all knew existed. You could see it from outside. Count the windows. 13 floors, but only 12 buttons. Until now, I should have just pressed L for lobby. Should have gotten my tea and gone back to bed. But something about that button. It seemed to pulse under the flickering elevator light, calling to me. I pressed it. The elevator lurched, not up or down, but sideways somehow. The lights dimmed to a sickly amber glow, and the usual mechanical hum became something else. Something that sounded almost like breathing. The floor counter above the doors went dark for a moment, then displayed 13. The doors opened slowly, reluctantly, revealing a hallway that looked exactly like mine on the 7th floor. Same ugly carpet with the faded rose pattern. Same beige walls. Same apartment numbers, 1301, 1302, 1303. But something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy, like breathing through wet cotton. And the silence wasn't just quiet, it was the complete absence of sound. So absolute it made my ears ring. Even my footsteps on that familiar carpet made no noise. I stepped out of the elevator. Why did I step out? And the doors immediately slid shut behind me. I spun around, jabbing at the call button, but it was dead, cold and unresponsive under my increasingly frantic fingers. Okay. There had to be stairs. I moved down the hallway, trying door handles as I went. All locked. But behind each door, I could hear something. Not quite voices, more like echoes of voices. Conversations happening just out of sync with reality. In apartment 1307, the same number as mine, I heard my own voice talking to someone. laughing at a joke I didn't remember making. The stairwell door at the end of the hall was marked with the usual exit sign, but the light flickered in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. My hand was slick with sweat as I pushed it open. The stairs went up and down, just like they should. But the moment I stepped onto them, I understood why people had stopped mentioning the 13th floor. The stairs didn't lead anywhere. I climbed up flight after flight, my legs burning, lungs gasping in that thick air. But every landing was marked with the same number, 13. I tried going down, same result. Always the 13th floor. Always that same hallway waiting beyond the door. I don't know how long I wandered those stairs. Time felt different. My phone was dead, the screen black no matter how many times I pressed the power button. Eventually, exhausted and beginning to panic, I returned to the 13th floor hallway. That's when I noticed the door to 1313 was slightly open, just a crack of darkness visible. And from inside, I could hear music, faint and tinny, like an old radio playing in another room. A song my grandmother used to hum, something from the 40s that I couldn't quite place. I pushed the door open wider. Hello? The apartment layout was identical to mine, but everything was wrong. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum or a tomb. Dust motes hung frozen in the air, not drifting, just suspended like tiny stars. And in the living room, sitting in a wingback chair facing the window, was a woman. She was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a house dress that belonged to another era. Her hair was pin-curled and she held a teacup that steamed even though I could see the liquid inside was long cold. She didn't turn when I entered. "You press the button." Her voice was hollow, like an echo of an echo. They always press the button eventually. Who are you?" She turned then, and I wish she hadn't. Her face was normal, pretty even. But her eyes were all wrong. They reflected too much light, like a cat's, and behind them was nothing. Just an endless depth that made my stomach lurch. "I'm Margaret. I lived in 1313. She smiled, and it was too wide. "Back when there was a 13th floor that people could leave." "What do you mean? How do I get out?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Out? Oh, honey, didn't anyone ever tell you? This floor isn't meant to be found. It's where the building keeps its secrets, its mistakes, its..." She paused, savoring the word. "Residents who couldn't pay their rent. That's insane. This is just... There has to be a way out." Margaret stood, moving with a fluidity that wasn't quite human. "There is, but you won't like it." She glided to the window and beckoned me over. "Look." I approached slowly, my reflection in the glass growing clearer with each step, but it wasn't quite right. The me in the window was a few seconds off, lagging behind my movements like a badly synced video. And behind that reflection, I could see the city, but not my Chicago. This one was older, darker. The skyline was all wrong. Buildings that had been demolished decades ago standing tall against a sky that couldn't decide what color it wanted to be. "Every building has a floor like this," Margaret continued. "A place between places, where the walls are thin and things leak through. The Grandviews had more leaks than most. People disappear here, you know, have for years. The management just paints over the doors, pretends the floor doesn't exist, but it does. And now, you're part of it." "No." I backed away from the window, from her, from all of it. "No, I have a job, I have a life. People will look for me." "Will they?" She tilted her head like a curious bird. "Check your pockets." I did, pulling out my wallet. My driver's license was blank, just a white rectangle where my photo and information should be. My credit cards, same thing. Every identifying piece of information had been erased. "The floor takes you slowly," Margaret whispered. "First your identity, then your connections, then your memories, until all that's left is another resident of the 13th floor, another secret the building keeps." I ran, stumbling out of Margaret's apartment and down the hall, trying every door again. This time, some opened. In 1301, I found an old man sitting at a desk writing the same letter over and over. His handwriting was perfect, mechanical, but when I looked closer, the words made no sense. Just random combinations of letters that formed shapes that hurt to look at. He didn't acknowledge me, just kept writing, his pen never running out of ink. 1302 was a children's nursery, but the toys moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Rocking horses that swayed without riders. Music boxes that played lullabies in languages that predated human speech. And in the corner, a crib that was too small for any baby I'd ever seen, but too large for what was actually in it. 1304 contained a dinner party that had been going on for decades. The guests were dressed in formal wear from different eras. Some in 1950s evening gowns, others in Victorian dress coats. They spoke in whispers about people who'd been dead for generations, passing dishes that spoiled and refreshed in endless cycles. When I opened the door, they all turned toward me in perfect synchronization, their faces eager and hungry. "Oh, wonderful," one of them exclaimed, a woman in a pearl necklace that was actually made of teeth. "We've been waiting for you to join us. We saved you a seat." The empty chair at the head of the table was ornate, almost throne-like, with restraints built into the arms. I slammed the door shut and heard their disappointed sighs through the wood. 1305 was filled with filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. Inside each drawer were manila folders containing the life stories of everyone who'd ever lived in the building. I found my own file, thick with documentation of conversations I'd never had, relationships I'd never formed, a life I'd never lived but somehow belonged to me. The last entry was dated today, describing my discovery of the 13th floor in clinical detail. In 1306, I discovered a workshop where someone was repairing broken things. Clocks that had stopped decades ago ticked with newfound purpose. Radios played programs from the 1940s, and at the workbench, hunched over a dollhouse that was an exact replica of the Grand View, was a figure I couldn't quite focus on. Every time I tried to look directly at it, my eyes slid away like oil on water. "Almost finished," it murmured without looking up. "Just need to add the new resident to the 13th floor." It held up a tiny figurine that looked exactly like me down to the clothes I was wearing. "Been working on this one for 3 years, ever since you moved in." In 1308, I found a family frozen around a dinner table. They moved in slow motion, passing dishes that never quite reached their destination. The child, a boy about 10, turned his head toward me over the course of what felt like minutes. When he finally spoke, his words stretched like taffy. "Help us." The mother's mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of teeth that went back too far. "Stay with us forever." 1309 was a library, but the books were alive. They whispered secrets to each other in languages that changed as I listened. Some volumes were bound in leather that felt too much like skin. Others had pages that bled when touched. The librarian behind the desk was a woman whose face was a constantly shifting arrangement of features, never quite settling on one identity. "Looking for something specific?" she asked, her voice a harmony of different people speaking in unison. "We have everything here. Every story that was never told. Every life that was never lived. Every scream that was never heard." 1310 was worse. The apartment was full of water that didn't obey physics. It hung in the air in impossible shapes, and things swam through it. Things that weren't quite fish, weren't quite human. They watched me with too many eyes as I slammed the door. 1311 housed a photography studio where the portraits moved. Black and white photos of families lined the walls, but the subjects shifted positions when I wasn't looking. In one photo, a 1920s family gradually turned their heads to follow my movement. In another, a Victorian couple's expressions changed from joy to terror to anger to hunger. The photographer emerged from the darkroom, his hands stained with chemicals that smelled like copper and fear. "Would you like a portrait? I specialize in capturing souls. Been perfecting the technique for 70 years. 13 to 12 was a dance studio where couples waltzed to music that came from nowhere. Their movements were perfect, synchronized, but their feet never quite touched the floor. They danced in patterns that formed symbols I almost recognized, sigils that made my head throb when I tried to understand them. But it was 1307, my apartment number, that broke something inside me, because when I finally got that door open, I saw myself, sitting on my couch, staring at a blank TV screen. This other me was thin, gaunt, like I hadn't eaten in weeks, maybe months. "You're early," the other me said without looking up. Usually takes them a few more hours to find their own door. What are you?" "I'm you, from Tuesday, or maybe last Tuesday, or next Tuesday. Time's funny here." He finally turned, and his eyes had that same reflective quality as Margaret's. "Did she tell you about the way out?" "She said I wouldn't like it." The other me laughed. My laugh. But wrong. You have to find the original sin, the first thing that went wrong with this floor, the reason they sealed it away. Fix that and maybe the elevator comes back. What was it? What happened here? Different for every building. The grand view. He stood, moving closer, and I could smell decay on his breath. The grand view had a party. 1953. Halloween. All the residents of the 13th floor were invited. Building management wanted to do something special. Bring the community together. He was close enough to touch now, and I could see things moving under his skin. But something else got invited too, something that came up from the basement, or down from the roof. Or maybe it was always here, waiting. It killed them all, every single resident of the 13th floor, in one night, and instead of dealing with it, instead of cleansing this place, management just sealed it, painted over the button, pretended it never happened. But the thing, is it still here? The other me smiled with too many teeth. "Oh, yes, it's been so hungry." And now, he lunged forward, jaw unhinging like a snake's. "It has you." I stumbled backward, fell, scrambled away as this thing that wore my face pursued me on all fours, moving with sickening speed. I burst out of the apartment and ran. No destination, just away. Behind me, I could hear doors opening. All of them, every resident of the 13th floor emerging into the hallway. They moved wrong, jerky, like marionettes with tangled strings. Margaret led them, her house dress now stained with something dark. The family from 1308 crawled along the ceiling. The water things from 1310 floated through the air, leaving trails of impossible moisture. The dinner party guests from 1304 glided forward in formation, their teeth chattering in anticipation. And they were all hungry. The hallway stretched as I ran, becoming longer than any building could contain. Door after door flashed past me, each one opening to reveal another horror. A room full of mirrors that showed different versions of myself, all of them screaming. A kitchen where someone was cooking a meal that smelled like childhood memories and tasted like despair. A bedroom where the bed was made of bones and the pillows were stuffed with regrets. Behind me, the residents gave chase. Their footsteps created a symphony of dread. The clicking of Margaret's heels, the wet slapping of the water things, the mechanical grinding of the other Emmy's joints. They whispered my name in voices that weren't quite human, promising things I didn't want to understand. I reached the end of the hall and found myself facing a door I hadn't seen before. It was different from the others, older. The wood was dark with age, and carved into its surface were symbols that hurt to look at directly. The number on the door read 1313 Ha. I could hear them getting closer. The temperature in the hallway was dropping, and frost began forming on the walls. My breath came out in visible puffs as I reached for the doorknob. It was locked. No. I fumbled in my pockets, searching for... What? I didn't have a key. I didn't have anything that could help me. That's when I felt it, a weight in my jacket pocket that hadn't been there before. I pulled out an ornate brass key, old and heavy, its surface etched with the same symbols as the door. Somehow, I knew this was what I needed. The key slid into the lock with a sound like breaking glass. The door swung open, revealing not another apartment, but a staircase that spiraled down into darkness. The stairs were made of the same dark wood as the door, and they descended further than my flashlight could reach. The residents had reached the end of the hall. They stood in a semicircle, watching me, but not approaching. Margaret smiled her too wide smile. "You can't go down there," she said. "That's where it lives. The thing that made us this way. The thing that's been waiting." Then maybe it's time I met it. I stepped onto the stairs and immediately felt the difference. The air was colder here, and it moved differently, like there were currents and eddies in the darkness. Each step down took me further from the 13th floor, but also deeper into whatever lay beneath it. The staircase seemed to go on forever. My legs ached, and my lungs burned with each breath of the thin, cold air. But eventually, I reached the bottom and found myself in a vast underground chamber that couldn't possibly exist beneath the grand view. The walls were lined with photographs, thousands of them dating back over a century. Black and white images of people in formal clothes, families posing stiffly for the camera, children with serious expressions. But as I moved closer, I realized these weren't just any photographs. They were pictures of everyone who had ever lived in the building, including people who were supposed to be alive. At the center of the chamber stood a figure I'd been expecting, but hoping never to see. It was tall, unnaturally thin, wearing a suit that belonged to no particular era. Its face was a void, a space where features should have been but weren't. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome," it said. "I've been waiting for you. You're the thing that killed them, the residents of the 13th floor." "Killed?" It laughed, a sound like wind through empty buildings. "I didn't kill anyone. I preserved them, gave them eternal life in their perfect moments. The grand view was my greatest work until they sealed it away from me. The fire, the 23 people who died. A misunderstanding. I was trying to save them, to bring them here where they could be safe forever. But humans are so fragile, so afraid of change. They fought me, and in their panic they created the very disaster they were trying to avoid." The thing moved closer, and I could feel its presence like ice water in my veins. "But you're different. You came here willingly. You pressed the button. You sought out the 13th floor. I want to leave. I want to go back to my life." "Your life?" It gestured to the photographs on the walls. "Look around you. Your life is here, all of it. Every moment you've lived, every decision you've made, every person you've loved. It's all preserved here, perfect and eternal." I looked at the photographs again and saw myself in many of them. Pictures from my childhood, my college years, my first job, but they were wrong somehow. In each photo I was looking directly at the camera with an expression of desperate fear, as if I was trying to warn the viewer about something terrible. "You've been watching me. I've been waiting for you. Ever since you moved into the building, I knew you were the one who would find the 13th floor." the one who would come to me willingly. I didn't come willingly. I was curious. That's different. Is it? The thing's voice took on an almost amused tone. You've been having trouble sleeping, staying awake at night, walking the halls. You've been looking for something, haven't you? Something to fill the emptiness in your life. I wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in my throat, because it was true. I had been searching for something, some meaning or purpose that my ordinary life lacked. I can give you that, the thing continued. Purpose, meaning, a place where you belong. All you have to do is accept it. Accept the 13th floor, accept me. And if I refuse, then you'll wander the floor forever, never aging, never dying, but never truly alive either, like the others, like Margaret and the family and all the rest. They could have chosen to join me, to become part of something greater. Instead, they chose to resist, and now they're trapped in their own little hells. I thought about the residents I'd met. The endless repetition of their actions, the hollow look in their eyes. They weren't living. They were just existing, caught in loops of their own making. There has to be another way. There is. The thing's voice became almost gentle, but you won't like it. I found myself back at the elevator, pounding on the doors until my fists bled. The residents circled me, closing in slowly, savoring the moment. That's when I noticed it. The brass plate beside the elevator. There was a keyhole I'd never seen before. Old-fashioned, like for a skeleton key. Looking for this? I turned. A man stood apart from the others, different. He wore a janitor's uniform from another era, and unlike the rest, his eyes were normal. Sad, but normal. In his hand, he held an ornate brass key. "Tommy Benson," he said, stepping closer. "I was the night janitor, 1953. I'm the only one who remembers what really happened." The other residents hissed and recoiled as he approached, but didn't interfere. He had authority here, or maybe they were just letting him play with his food. "There was no party," Tommy continued. "No monster from the basement. You want to know the real reason they sealed this floor?" I nodded, unable to speak. "Asbestos, lead paint, faulty wiring. The whole floor was a death trap, but the building owners didn't want to pay for repairs, so they just moved everyone out, told them it was temporary. But some residents refused to leave, squatters, the management called them. So they sent me up here one night to change the locks, cut the power, force them out." He held up the key, and in its reflection, I could see scenes playing out. Families huddled in dark apartments, children crying, old people who had nowhere else to go. "I did my job," Tommy whispered. "Locked them in, all of them. The plan was to come back in the morning, when they were desperate enough to leave. But there was a fire that night, started in 1313, Margaret Morrison's apartment. She'd been using candles since I cut the power. The scenes in the key grew darker. Smoke, flames, people pounding on doors that wouldn't open. 23 people died. Men, women, children, and the owners. They covered it up, paid off the fire department, sealed the floor, painted over the tragedy like it never happened. But the building remembers. The 13th floor remembers. And it's been waiting for someone to acknowledge what happened here." "But what about the thing downstairs? The creature that—" "There is no creature," Tommy said sadly. "There never was. Just guilt. Just the weight of what was done here. The building, it's sick, infected with the pain of those who died. And that sickness, it creates things, manifestations, ways to keep the truth hidden." I thought about the figure in the underground chamber, the thing that had offered me eternal life. So none of it was real. It was real, but it wasn't a monster. It was the building's way of coping with trauma, of trying to make sense of senseless death. The residents you met, they're real too. They're the echoes of the people who died here, trapped in the moment of their greatest fear. So how do I get out? My voice was barely a whisper. Tommy smiled sadly. You tell the truth. You go back, if you can, and you make sure everyone knows what happened here. Break the silence. Honor the dead. That's the only way the 13th floor lets anyone go. He tossed me the key. It was heavy, heavier than brass should be. But here's the thing. Even if you get out, you'll never really leave. You've seen us now. We're part of you. And every time you pass a 13th floor, any 13th floor, you'll wonder if we're there, waiting, watching, hungry. I inserted the key into the lock beside the elevator. It turned with a sound like breaking bones. The elevator doors groaned open, revealing not the car, but a swirling darkness that pulled at me like a vacuum. Go, Tommy urged, before they change their minds, before the floor decides to keep you anyway. Go! I jumped into the darkness and woke up on the floor of the regular elevator, the normal buttons glowing softly above me. My phone showed 3:47 a.m. I'd been gone for 14 minutes, that's all. 14 minutes that felt like hours. I stumbled out of the elevator on shaking legs, ran to my apartment, 707, not 1307, and locked the door behind me. Safe, I was safe, but I wasn't. Not really. The next morning I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. A stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep. But when I looked in the mirror, my reflection was a half-second off, and in my jacket pocket I found something that shouldn't have been there. A photograph, black and white, showing the residents of the 13th floor during what must have been happier times. They were gathered in the lobby, smiling at the camera. Margaret was there in her house dress, looking young and alive. The family from 1308 stood together, the little boy grinning gap-toothed at the camera. Tommy the janitor was in the background, his uniform clean and pressed. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, Grandview Apartments, 13th floor residence, Halloween 1953, never forget. I did what Tommy said. I researched. Found old newspaper articles about a fire at the Grandview that had been buried in the back pages. 23 people, just like he said. The coverage was minimal, almost dismissive. Minor fire in apartment building. No significant injuries reported. Building management assures residents of continued safety. But I dug deeper, found death certificates filed weeks later, when the bodies were finally identified. Found records of families who'd suddenly stopped receiving mail, children who'd stopped attending school, elderly residents who'd missed doctor's appointments. 23 people who'd simply vanished from the world, their deaths covered up by money and influence. I wrote about it online, told anyone who would listen. Some believed me, most didn't. But something strange began to happen. I started receiving messages from people in other cities, other buildings. They'd found 13th floors too. Different stories, different tragedies, but always the same pattern. Buildings with secrets, floors that shouldn't exist, residents who'd been forgotten. In Detroit, a woman found a 13th floor filled with workers from a 1960s factory fire. In Boston, a man discovered apartments full of immigrants who'd died in a tenement collapse. In Los Angeles, someone encountered the victims of a 1940s hotel fire that had been blamed on faulty wiring, but was actually arson. Every building, it seemed, had a floor like mine, a place where the walls were thin and the forgotten dead waited for acknowledgement. I started a website, the 13th Floor Project, a place for people to share their stories, to honor the dead, to break the silence that had kept these tragedies hidden. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of stories poured in from around the world. Not just about 13th floors, but about forgotten basements, sealed attics, abandoned wings of hospitals and schools. But the more I investigated, the more I realized that the 13th floor wasn't done with me. I began to notice things: elevators that lingered too long on certain floors, stairwells that echoed with voices that weren't there, reflections that moved independently of their sources. And sometimes in the corner of my eye, I see them. The residents. Margaret in her blood-stained dress. The family still passing their eternal dinner. The other me, hungry and patient. Tommy, nodding approvingly at my efforts but warning me with his eyes that I was walking a dangerous path. Because the 13th floor is still there. In my building. In yours, maybe. Waiting behind painted-over buttons and sealed doors. Hungry for acknowledgement. Hungry for visitors. And now that I've told their story, now that I've broken the silence, they're stronger than ever. Some nights, when my insomnia is bad, I stand in front of the elevator. The button's not visible anymore. They painted over it again the next day. But I know it's there. I can feel it calling to me. And I know that one night, maybe tonight, I'll press it again. Because the 13th floor never really lets you go. It just lets you visit the other floors for a while. And every time I help someone else find their building's secrets, every time I share another story of the forgotten dead, I feel the pull growing stronger. The residents aren't angry anymore, they're grateful. But gratitude from the dead is a heavy burden to carry. They want more than just acknowledgement now. They want justice. They want the people responsible for their deaths to face consequences. And they're willing to use me to get it. Last week, I found the grandson of the building owner who'd ordered the 13th floor sealed. He's a real estate developer now, following in his grandfather's footsteps. He owns buildings across the city, and I have a feeling some of them have their own hidden floors. The residents whisper to me about what he's done, what he's covered up. They show me visions of other tragedies, other forgotten deaths. They want me to expose him, to bring him to justice. And if I refuse, well, they've shown me what happens to people who disappoint the dead. My reflection is getting worse. Sometimes it's minutes behind my actual movements. Sometimes it does things I'm not doing at all. And in the mirror, I can see the 13th floor reflected behind me. Even when I'm nowhere near the building, I'm changing. Becoming something between the living and the dead. A bridge between worlds. And I'm not sure how much longer I can resist the pull of the 13th floor. If you made it this far, check your building's elevator tomorrow. Count the floors from the outside, then count the buttons. Do they match? They should match. Unless your building has secrets too. And if you find an extra button, a floor that shouldn't exist, don't press it. Not yet. Send me a message first. Tell me about your building, your city, your 13th floor. Because I'm collecting them now. Mapping them. Understanding the pattern. And I think I know what's coming next. The residents aren't content to stay hidden anymore. They're organizing. Communicating across buildings, across cities, across the thin spaces between our world and theirs. They're planning something big, something that will force the world to acknowledge what's been done to them. And they want me to help. I've been having dreams about a great gathering, 13th floors from around the world opening simultaneously. The forgotten dead stepping out of their hidden places and into the light. The living forced to confront the sins of the past. The tragedies that have been swept under the rug, the people who've been erased from history. It would be chaos. Beautiful, terrible chaos. Justice for the dead, even if it means the end of the world as we know it. I used to think I was the only one who'd found the 13th floor, but now I know better. There are others like me, bridge builders, storytellers, people who've seen the hidden floors and lived to tell about it. We're spread across the globe, each of us carrying the weight of our building's secrets. And we're all receiving the same invitation, the same whispered promise in the dead of night. Come back. Come home. Help us finish what we started. The 13th floor of the Grandview is calling to me right now. I can feel it pulling at my consciousness, urging me to return. And I know that when I do, I won't be coming back alone. The residents will follow me out, and they'll spread to other buildings, other cities, other forgotten places where the dead wait to be remembered. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's time for the world to face its hidden shames. Maybe it's time for the 13th floors to be acknowledged. I've made my choice. Tonight, at 3:33 a.m., I'm going back to the elevator. I'm going to press that button one more time. But this time, I'm not going alone. I'm bringing witnesses. I'm bringing cameras. I'm bringing the truth. Because the dead deserve to be remembered. The forgotten deserve to be found. And the 13th floor deserves to be acknowledged. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them after reading this. And remember, some doors are sealed for a reason, but sometimes those are exactly the doors that need to be opened. Like and subscribe if you want to know what happens next. And if you're reading this after 3:33 a.m. on any given night, check your elevator. The residents might be waiting for you too. 3 days after I posted the story online, my inbox exploded. Not just with comments and reactions, but with something else. Something that made my blood run cold. Photographs. Dozens of them. All showing the same thing. Elevator buttons that shouldn't exist. 13th floors, missing floors, floors marked with symbols instead of numbers. But these weren't random pranks or Photoshop jobs. These were real. I could tell because each photo came with a story, and every story followed the same pattern. Sarah from Portland. Found this button in my apartment building after my neighbor disappeared. Building management claims there's no 13th floor, but I counted the windows. There are 13 rows. Marcus from Atlanta. The elevator in my office building has been acting weird lately. Yesterday I found this button between floors 6 and 8. It's warm to the touch, and sometimes I swear I can hear music coming from behind it. Elena from Phoenix. My grandmother lived in this building for 40 years. She always said there was a floor they sealed off after the fire in 1962. I thought she was just getting old, but then I found this. The photographs kept coming. From Manchester, England. A button marked with a symbol that looked like a burning cross. From Tokyo, a floor marked 13.5 that only appeared after midnight. From Sao Paulo. An elevator that sometimes stopped at a floor labeled Los Olvidados, the Forgotten. But it wasn't just the photographs that convinced me. It was the details. The way each person described the same thick air, the same absolute silence, the same feeling of being watched. They were all finding the same thing I had found. Different buildings, different cities, different countries, but the same 13th floor. And they were all being called to return. I started a private forum for the 13th floor survivors, as we began calling ourselves. Within a week, we had over 100 members. Within a month, nearly 1,000. People from every continent, every culture, every walk of life. But we all shared the same experience. We had found floors that shouldn't exist, and those floors had changed us. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychiatrist from Seattle, was the first to propose a theory. What if, she wrote in the forum, these floors aren't supernatural at all? What if they're psychological manifestations of collective trauma? Buildings absorb the emotional energy of the people who live in them. Tragedies, deaths, forgotten sorrows. They leave psychic imprints. It was a rational explanation, and for a while some of us clung to it. But then people started sharing videos. The first one came from a teenager in Baltimore named Kevin. He'd found a 13th floor in his apartment building, and unlike the rest of us, he'd had the presence of mind to record everything. The video was shaky, poorly lit, but it showed things that no psychological theory could explain. A hallway that stretched and contracted like a living thing. Doors that opened onto rooms that were bigger on the inside than the outside. And residents, ghostly figures that moved through the frame like smoke. their faces partially obscured but their eyes burning with an intensity that came through even in the grainy footage. "This is apartment 1307, Kevin whispered into his phone camera. "Same number as mine, but look at this." He panned the camera around a living room that was identical to his own, but wrong in subtle ways. The furniture was arranged differently. The family photos on the mantel showed people he didn't recognize, and sitting on the couch, watching a television that displayed only static, was a figure that looked exactly like him. The figure turned towards the camera, and Kevin's sharp intake of breath was clearly audible. The other Kevin smiled and waved, then mouthed words that were clearly visible even without sound. "You're next." The video cut out there. Kevin posted an update 3 days later. "I can't leave my apartment. Every time I try to go outside, I end up back on the 13th floor. It's like the building won't let me go. My reflection is getting worse. Sometimes it moves before I do. Sometimes it does things I'm not doing at all. I think I'm becoming one of them." That was his last post. Similar videos began appearing from around the world. Shaky phone footage of impossible hallways, rooms that defied physics, residents who shouldn't exist. And in every video, the person filming seemed to be losing themselves bit by bit, becoming more like the ghostly figures they were documenting. We were all changing, all of us who had found the 13th floors, some more than others, but the pattern was consistent. Reflections that lagged behind, voices that echoed from empty rooms, dreams that felt more real than waking life, and all of us were being called back. The messages started appearing in the forum around the same time, posted by accounts that shouldn't have existed. Usernames like Margaret1313 and Tommy Janitor and The Other You. They posted at exactly 3:33 a.m. in their respective time zones, and their messages were always the same. "It's time. Come home. Bring the others." Dr. Walsh was the first to suggest we meet in person. "Whatever's happening to us," she wrote, "we need to understand it. We need to document it properly, and we need to do it before we lose ourselves completely." The meeting was set for October 31st, Halloween, the anniversary of the first 13th floor incident I documented. The location was chosen by vote, Chicago, because it was central and because my building, the Grandview, seemed to be some kind of nexus point for the phenomenon. 23 people showed up, the same number as the residents who had died in the original fire. I don't think that was a coincidence. We met in a hotel conference room first, sharing our stories, comparing notes, trying to make sense of what was happening to us. But as the evening wore on, the pull became stronger. One by one, we found ourselves looking toward the windows, toward the direction of the Grandview. "We have to go," said Maria, a woman from Mexico City who'd found a 13th floor in her grandmother's apartment building. "I can feel them calling, all of them. They're waiting for us." "This is insane," Dr. Walsh protested. "We're talking about walking into what could be a mass hallucination, a shared psychotic episode." "Then explain this," said David, a man from London who'd brought his own video evidence. He played a recording on his phone, security footage from his building's lobby. In the video, people could be seen entering the elevator alone. But when the doors opened on other floors, they weren't alone anymore. Shadowy figures accompanied them, figures that looked like echoes of the people they were with. "They're already here," David continued. "The residents. They're not trapped in their buildings anymore. They're spreading, following us, and they're getting stronger." He was right. I could feel them around us, just out of sight. Margaret with her too wide smile. Tommy with his sad eyes. The other me with his hungry gaze. They were all here, waiting. As midnight approached, we made our decision. All 23 of us would go to the Grandview. We would document whatever happened. And if we didn't come back, well, at least we'd face it together. The walk to the Grandview was surreal. The streets of Chicago were busy with Halloween revelers, but they seemed distant, muffled, like we were walking through a different world that only occasionally overlapped with theirs. Streetlights flickered as we passed. Car radios played songs from decades past. And in every reflection, every window, every puddle, every polished surface, we could see them walking with us. The building looked different when we arrived. Taller somehow, with more windows than I remembered. The lobby was empty, but the elevator was waiting for us with its doors open. And there, between the buttons for floors 12 and 14, was the 13th floor button, visible to everyone. "Together," said Dr. Walsh, and pressed the button. The elevator lurched, not up or down, but sideways through dimensions that shouldn't exist. The walls became transparent, showing us glimpses of other cities, other buildings, other 13th floors. We were traveling through the network, the hidden connection between all the forgotten places. When the doors opened, we stepped out into a hallway that was impossibly long, stretching to horizons that couldn't exist inside any building. Doors lined both sides, each one marked with a different apartment number from a different building around the world. 1313 from my Grandview, 1307 from Kevin's building in Baltimore, 1350 from Maria's grandmother's place in Mexico City. And walking toward us down that endless hallway came the residents. All of them. From every building, every city, every 13th floor that had ever existed. They moved in perfect synchronization, their footsteps creating a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Margaret led them, but she wasn't alone. Beside her walked other figures, the forgotten dead from around the world. A man in overalls who'd died in a factory fire. A woman in a nurse's uniform who'd perished in a hospital collapse. Children who'd been lost in tenement blazes, all of them united by the same thing. They had been forgotten, erased from history, sealed away from the world. "You came," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the impossible distance. "All of you, the bridge builders, the storytellers, the ones who remember. What do you want from us?" Dr. Walsh asked, though her voice shook with fear. "To be remembered," said a voice that came from all of them at once. "To be acknowledged, to have our stories told. You've started the process, but it's not enough. The world needs to see us. The world needs to know what was done to us." "And if we refuse?" asked David. The residents smiled, and their smiles were all wrong. "Then you'll join us. Forever. Trapped between worlds. Forgotten like we were forgotten. But if you help us, if you open the doors and let us out, we'll give you what you've been searching for." "What's that?" I asked. "Purpose," said the other me, stepping forward from the crowd. "Meaning, a place where you belong. You've all been lost, haven't you? Searching for something to fill the emptiness in your lives. We can give you that. We can make you part of something greater." It was tempting. God help me, it was tempting. I could feel the pull of it, the promise of belonging, of having a purpose that mattered. And looking at the faces of my fellow survivors, I could see they felt it too. But then I thought about the world above. The people who were still living, still breathing, still hoping for better days. Did they deserve to have their world invaded by the hungry dead? Did they deserve to pay for the sins of previous generations? "There has to be another way," I said. "There is," said Tommy, stepping forward. "But it requires sacrifice from all of you." Tommy led us to a room at the end of the impossible hallway. It was circular, with walls lined with photographs, millions of them, showing every person who had ever lived in a building with a 13th floor. The forgotten dead, the living who had found them, the generations who had sealed them away. In the center of the room stood a table with 23 chairs around it, and on the table was a book, ancient, leather-bound, with pages that seemed to shift and change as we looked at them. "The registry," Tommy explained. "Every building with a 13th floor is recorded here, every tragedy, every cover-up, every forgotten death. It's the source of our power, the thing that connects all the hidden floors. What do you want us to do? Asked Maria. Sign it, said Margaret. Add your names to the registry. Become official guardians of the forgotten. You'll have the power to open any 13th floor, to bring the residents into the light. But you'll also be bound to us, forever. And if we don't? Dr. Walsh asked. Then the residents will find another way, Tommy said sadly. They'll keep spreading, keep growing stronger, until they don't need permission to enter the world above. And when that happens, well, the living and the dead aren't meant to share the same space. I looked at the book, at the quill pen that lay beside it. The ink in the inkwell was dark red, and I had a feeling it wasn't ink at all. What happens to us if we sign? I asked. You become like me, Tommy said. Guardians between worlds. You'll age more slowly, see things others can't see, know things others can't know. But you'll also be responsible for maintaining the balance, for making sure the dead are remembered without letting them consume the living. And if we refuse, then you'll all become residents of the 13th floor, said the other me. Trapped forever in the space between life and death. And the registry will find new guardians. It always does. One by one, we took our seats around the table. The book opened itself, revealing pages covered in names written in that same dark red ink. Names going back centuries, in languages from around the world. All of them guardians who had made the same choice we were facing. Together, said Dr. Walsh, and reached for the pen. We signed in order, each of us adding our name to the registry. The ink was warm, almost alive, and it seemed to pulse with each signature. As the last name was added, the room began to change. The walls became transparent, showing us views of every 13th floor in the world. We could see them all now, the hidden spaces where the forgotten dead waited, and we could feel them. Every resident, every tragedy, every covered-up death. They were all part of us now, their stories flowing through our consciousness like a river of memory. But we were also changed. I could feel the difference immediately. My reflection in the room's mirrors was solid, real, no longer lagging behind my movements. But my eyes now held the same depth I'd seen in the residents' eyes. The weight of too much knowledge, too much responsibility. Welcome to the registry, Tommy said, and for the first time since I'd met him, he smiled. Now the real work begins. That was 6 months ago. Since then, the world has changed in ways most people don't even notice. 13th floors are appearing everywhere, not just in old buildings, but in new ones too. The dead are no longer content to be forgotten, and the registry has given them a voice. But we've managed to maintain the balance. The residents can now move freely between their floors and the world above, but they can't stay for long. They appear to people who need to hear their stories, who need to understand the weight of history, who need to be reminded that actions have consequences. A corrupt politician finds himself face to face with the victims of a fire he caused through his negligence. A negligent landlord is visited by the ghosts of tenants who died because he cut corners on safety. A corporation executive is haunted by the workers who died in factories he ordered to remain open despite dangerous conditions. Justice, of a sort. Not the violent uprising the residents had originally planned, but something more subtle, more lasting. The dead are being remembered. Their stories are being told. And the living are being forced to confront the sins of the past. As for us guardians, we've adapted. We still live in the world above, but we're changed. We can see the thin places where the dead slipped through. We can hear the whispers of the forgotten, and we're responsible for making sure their stories reach the right people. I still live in the Grandview, but apartment 707 is different now. Sometimes I hear voices from the 13th floor, carried up through the vents and walls. Margaret laughing at something on her old radio, the family from 1308 discussing their eternal dinner plans. Tommy humming as he makes his rounds. They're not angry anymore. They're not hungry. They're just present. Part of the building's story, acknowledged and remembered. And late at night, when the building is quiet and the city sleeps, I sometimes take the elevator to the 13th floor. Not as a prisoner or a victim, but as a guardian. I walk the halls, checking on the residents, listening to their stories, making sure they're remembered. Because that's what the dead want, in the end. Not revenge, not to drag the living down with them. They just want to be remembered. They want their stories to matter. They want to know that their lives and deaths meant something. And now, through the registry, they do. If you've read this far, you're probably wondering if any of this is real. If there really are 13th floors hidden in buildings around the world. If the dead really walk among us, telling their stories to anyone who will listen. The answer is, it depends on what you're willing to see. The registry is real. The guardians are real. The 13th floors are real. But they exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between the rational and the impossible. You won't find them if you're looking for scientific proof or logical explanations. You'll only find them if you're willing to believe that some stories are too important to be forgotten. So here's my invitation. Pay attention to the buildings around you. Notice the floors that don't quite add up. Listen for the voices in the walls. Look for the faces in the windows that shouldn't be there. And if you find a 13th floor, if you press that button and step into the space between worlds, remember that you're not alone. The guardians are watching. The registry is always looking for new names, and the dead are always ready to share their stories with someone who will listen. The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, some doors are meant to be opened. Some stories are meant to be told. And some floors are meant to be found. Sweet dreams. And remember to count the floors. The registry of the forgotten is always accepting new members. If you've found a 13th floor, or if you've been chosen as a guardian, you can find us. We're in the spaces between spaces, in the floors that shouldn't exist, in the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Welcome to the 13th floor. Welcome to the registry. Welcome home. Story number 3. The first time I saw it happen, I was drinking my morning coffee, black with 2 sugars, just like always. The scarecrow in the Henderson's cornfield had turned its head. Not much, maybe 15 degrees to the left, but enough that I noticed, enough that the hair on my neck stood up like warning flags. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another creepy pasta, let me tell you something. What happened in our little town of Millbrook, Iowa last October. It's going to make you look at every scarecrow differently, every single one. And if you live near farmland, well, you might want to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what I'm about to tell you could save your life. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm about to share the most terrifying 3 weeks of my existence. Stick around till the end, because the truth about those scarecrows, it's not what anyone expected. Not even close. Let me paint you a picture of Millbrook. Population 2,847, the kind of place where everyone knows your middle name and what you had for dinner last Tuesday. Main Street has exactly 3 stoplights. A diner that's been serving the same apple pie recipe since 1952, and enough cornfields to make you dizzy if you stare at them too long while driving. I moved here 5 years ago from Chicago, trading skyscrapers for silos, concrete for corn. My husband Jake got a job managing Henderson Farm, the biggest agricultural operation in the county. We bought a little Victorian house on Maple Avenue, painted it sage green, and settled into what we thought would be a quiet life. That October morning started like any other. Jake had left before dawn to check on the harvest crew. I was working from home, designing websites for clients who didn't care if I lived in Manhattan or Mars, as long as their sites looked good. from my home office window, I had a perfect view of the Hendersons' east field, row after row of corn, golden in the autumn light, and right in the middle, their scarecrow. Old Jim, they called him, dressed in faded overalls and a John Deere cap that had seen better decades. I'd been staring at that scarecrow every morning for 5 years. Same position, same angle, same lifeless slump, until that morning. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. Maybe I needed new glasses, maybe the coffee wasn't strong enough. But no, old Jim's head had definitely moved. Instead of facing the road like always, he was looking toward the Henderson farmhouse. I grabbed my phone, scrolled to the photo I'd taken last week for an Instagram post about autumn vibes. There it was, proof, in the photo. Old Jim faced the road. Now, he faced the house. My rational mind kicked in immediately. Wind had to be wind. Even though the cornstalk stood perfectly still, even though the weather app showed 0 Emperor winds. I texted Jake, "Hey babe, did anyone adjust the scarecrow in the east field?" His response came quick. "Why would anyone touch that thing? It's been there since the 90s. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Why are you asking?" I hesitated. How do you tell your husband you think a scarecrow moved on its own without sounding completely unhinged? Just noticed it looked different, probably just me being weird. LOL. City girl still getting used to country life. Don't let old Jim spook you. But here's the thing. I was spooked, really spooked, because as I watched, I could have sworn I saw old Jim's shoulders rise and fall, like he was breathing. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. Every morning, coffee in hand, I'd check old Jim's position, take a photo, compare it to the day before, and every morning, something was different. Tuesday, both arms had shifted, hanging lower than before. Wednesday, his whole body had rotated maybe 20 degrees eastward. Thursday, the hat sat at a different angle, and was that straw sticking out where it hadn't been before? I started a spreadsheet. Yes, a spreadsheet. Because that's what anxious web designers do. Date, time, position, weather conditions. I even measured angles using a protractor app on my phone. Jake thought I was losing it. "Honey, it's October. Halloween season. You're just getting caught up in the spooky atmosphere." But I knew what I was seeing. And I wasn't the only one. At Murphy's Diner that Friday, I overheard Ethel Morrison talking to Betty Clark. "My scarecrow's been acting up too. Found it in a different spot this morning. Clear on the other side of my pumpkin patch." My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. "You too?" Betty whispered, leaning in close. "Our scarecrow. The one my grandson made last year. I found it lying down yesterday, like it had decided to take a nap. I must have made a sound, because both women turned to look at me. "Sarah, honey, you okay?" Ethel asked, her voice full of that Midwestern concern that could either comfort you or make you feel like a specimen under a microscope. Yeah, just your scarecrows. They've been moving?" The two women exchanged a look, the kind of look that said there was more to this story. Much more. "Best not to talk about it too loud," Betty said, glancing around the diner. "People already think we're going senile." But I pressed, "How long has this been happening?" Ethel stirred her coffee slowly, deliberately. "Started about a week ago, right around the harvest moon." "Mine too," Betty nodded. "Thought it was teenagers playing pranks, but what?" They exchanged that look again. "But teenagers don't leave those kinds of tracks," Ethel finished. "Tracks?" Betty pulled out her phone, swiped to her photos. What she showed me made my blood run cold. Around the base of her scarecrow, pressed deep into the soft earth, were footprints, but not human footprints. These were wrong, all wrong, too long, too narrow, with what looked like drag marks between each step, like something was pulling itself forward. Betty whispered, something that didn't quite know how to walk. I drove home in a daze, parked in our driveway, and just sat there, staring at old Jim in the distance. He was facing our house again. I was sure of it. And was he closer to the edge of the field than before, that night? I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of our old house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Jake held me close, told me I was being silly, but I could feel the tension in his body too. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of our motion sensor light clicking on. I crept to the window, peered through the curtains. Nothing. Just our empty yard, bathed in harsh white light. Then I looked beyond, toward the cornfield, and I swear on everything I hold dear, old Jim wasn't there. The next morning, old Jim was back in his spot, but his overalls were muddy, fresh mud, still wet, and caught on one of his glove's fingers was something that made my heart skip. A piece of fabric, sage green fabric, the exact shade of our house's siding. I called in sick to work, spent the day researching, Googling everything I could think of. Scarecrows moving on their own. Haunted Scarecrows, Iowa. Scarecrow folklore. Most of it was nonsense, urban legends, creepypasta, bad horror movie plots. But then I found something. An old newspaper archive from the Millbrook Gazette. October 1987. Local farmer claims scarecrows come alive during harvest season. The article was brief, dismissive, treating it like the ramblings of a drunk farmer. But the details matched exactly what we were experiencing. Scarecrows changing positions, strange tracks, and then this line that made my blood freeze. Farmer Johnson warns residents to burn their scarecrows before Halloween, claiming they're looking for something, and God help us when they find it. I needed to know more. The library. Millbrook's tiny library might have records. Local history, something. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who'd probably been there since the library opened in 1963, looked at me strangely when I asked about scarecrow incidents. Now, why would a nice young woman like you be interested in that old nonsense? Please, Mrs. Patterson, I need to know. She studied me for a long moment, then sighed. Follow me. She led me to a back room I'd never noticed before. Dusty, cramped, filled with boxes of old documents. From one of these boxes, she pulled out a leather-bound journal. This belonged to Cornelius Henderson, founded Henderson Farm back in 1889. He wrote about incidents, things that happened during harvest time. The journal was hard to read. Faded ink, old-fashioned handwriting. But certain passages stood out clear as day. October 15th, 1891. The straw men walk again. Found them gathered in the north field at dawn, standing in a circle, silent as death itself. October 22nd, 1891. Lost 2 chickens, then a pig. Something tore them apart. Left pieces arranged in patterns I dare not describe. The scarecrows. Their positions have changed. They face the house now, all of them. October 29th, 1891. God forgive me. I know what they want. They want what gave them form, what brought them to this mockery of life. The harvest moon showed me the truth. In the cornfield, I saw them, saw what they're becoming. The entry cut off there. The next page had been torn out. What happened to him? I asked. though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Mrs. Patterson closed the journal carefully. Found dead in his field. Halloween night, 1891. They said it was a heart attack, but my grandmother, who worked as a maid at the Henderson house back then, she said they found him surrounded by scarecrows, dozens of them, all moved from neighboring farms. And they were standing on their own. No stakes, no supports, just standing there, watching him die. I left the library feeling sick. The rational part of my brain kept trying to find explanations. Mass hysteria, coincidence, elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew something was happening. Something that had happened before. And it was escalating that evening. Jake came home looking shaken. "Sarah, we need to talk." He'd found 3 of the Henderson farm's scarecrows in the barn, not stored there, not placed there by any of the workers. They were just there, standing among the equipment, facing the door, waiting. And Sarah, their eyes, I know they're just buttons, but I swear they were following me. We made a decision that night. We were going to take down every scarecrow we could find, burn them, just like Farmer Johnson had warned back in 1987. Better to look crazy than to ignore what was right in front of us. But when we went out the next morning, armed with gasoline and matches, they were gone. Every single scarecrow in Millbrook vanished. And that's when the real terror began. October 30th, the day before Halloween, the day our quiet town became a nightmare. I woke up at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of sirens. Multiple sirens. Police, fire, ambulance, all screaming through the pre-dawn darkness. Jake was already pulling on his clothes. "Something's happened at the Henderson place. I have to go. I'm coming with you." "Sarah, no, stay here where it's safe." Safe, if only he knew how wrong he was. The Henderson farmhouse was chaos. Emergency vehicles everywhere. Lights painting the corn gold and red. And there, in the middle of the front yard, was Mr. Henderson himself, sitting in a lawn chair, staring at nothing, completely catatonic. Sheriff Martinez saw us approaching. "Jake, Sarah, you folks need to stay back." "What happened?" Jake asked. The sheriff ran a hand through his gray hair. "Damnedest thing I've ever seen. Mrs. Henderson called 911 around 4 a.m., said her husband went outside to check on something and started screaming. When we got here, we found him like this, and..." He trailed off, looking genuinely disturbed. "And what?" "And we found them." He led us around the house, and there, in the backyard, were the scarecrows. All of them. Every scarecrow from every farm in Millbrook, arranged in concentric circles. 7 circles, with Mr. Henderson's lawn chair placed precisely in the center. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they weren't on stakes anymore. They were standing. Just standing. Impossible. But there they were. And they were so much taller than I remembered. Had they always been 7 feet tall? 8 feet? "We tried to knock one over," Deputy Williams said, his voice shaky. "But they're rooted, like their feet go deep into the ground." I stepped closer to examine one. Old Jim, of course. His button eyes seemed to track my movement. No, that was impossible. Just my imagination. Then I saw it, carved into the wooden post that formed his spine. Symbols. Intricate patterns that hurt to look at. They seemed to shift and writhe, like living things. "Sarah, get back." Jake pulled me away, but it was too late. I'd seen what I needed to see. Those symbols. I'd seen them before. In Cornelius Henderson's journal. the patterns he dare not describe, and suddenly, horribly, I understood. "We need to evacuate the town," I said. "Right now, before tonight." Sheriff Martinez looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Evacuate? Because of some pranks with scarecrows? This isn't a prank." I pulled out my phone, showed him the photos of the journal pages I'd taken. "This has happened before. 1891, 1932, 1967, 19... Every 20 to 30 years during certain harvest moons, and each time, people die. You're talking about fairy tales, urban legends. Then explain that." I pointed at the scarecrows. "Explain how they're standing without support. Explain the symbols. Explain why Mr. Henderson won't stop staring at them." Before he could answer, a sound cut through the morning air, low, rhythmic, like breathing, but multiplied. Coming from everywhere at once, the scarecrows were breathing, not moving, not visibly, but the sound was unmistakable. In and out, perfectly synchronized. Deputy Williams stumbled backward. "What the hell?" And then, as the first ray of sunlight broke the horizon, they stopped. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. 24 hours, I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We have 24 hours until Halloween night, until they finish whatever they're doing." Jake gripped my hand tight. "How do you know?" "Because Cornelius Henderson knew. He figured it out. That's why he tore out that journal page. He didn't want anyone to know what he'd learned, what they really are." "What are they, Sarah?" I looked at the circles of scarecrows, at their patient, waiting stance, at Mr. Henderson, still frozen in his chair, eyes wide with whatever horror he'd witnessed. "They're not scarecrows," I said. "They never were. They're markers, anchors, for something much older, much hungrier, and every generation. We dress them up, stuff them with straw, and plant them in our fields, not to scare away crows, but to keep something satisfied, to show it we remember our agreement." "What agreement?" But I didn't have to answer, because Mr. Henderson, silent until now, began to speak, not to us, to them, in a language that predated words, that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primitive parts of our brains that still remembered when humans were prey. And the scarecrows, they answered. The evacuation was chaos. Sheriff Martinez, convinced by what we'd all witnessed, called in state police, even the National Guard. But Millbrook is a stubborn town. Not everyone wanted to leave, not everyone believed. By sunset on Halloween, only about half the town had evacuated. The rest barricaded themselves in their homes. Some even threw Halloween parties, defiant in their disbelief. Jake and I should have left. We'd packed our car, were ready to go, but I couldn't. Not without understanding, not without knowing if there was a way to stop it. So, as darkness fell, we returned to the Henderson farm. The scarecrows had moved again, no longer in circles. They now stood in a vast spiral, arms outstretched, fingers pointing toward the center where Mr. Henderson still sat, still spoke in that terrible non-language, and in the corn. Things were moving, not scarecrows. The corn itself, rustling, whispering, forming patterns that made my eyes water to follow. "Sarah, we need to go, now." But I was already moving forward, drawn by something I couldn't name. In my hand, Cornelius Henderson's journal, the weight of history, of truth. As I approached the spiral's edge, old Jim turned his head to look at me, not the slow, creaking movement I'd observed before. Smooth, deliberate, alive. His button eyes were gone, in their place, something that reflected the moon like oil on water. "You know," his voice was wind through straw, earth scraping wood. "You've always known, and God help me. I did The agreement, the price, the thing that Millbrook had been feeding for over a century without knowing it. Every scarecrow we made, every figure we stuffed with straw and dressed in our old clothes. We were making offerings, vessels, for something that had been here long before the first plow broke Iowa soil. The harvest, old Jim continued, other scarecrows joining their voices to his. We are the harvest, and tonight we return to the earth that made us, unless what? But I knew the torn journal page in my pocket, the one I'd found hidden in another box at the library. Cornelius Henderson's final entry. Unless someone takes our place, willingly, knowingly, one life for the town, one guardian for each generation. That's why Mr. Henderson was here, he knew. His family had always known. Passed down the secret, the burden, and when the time came, they paid the price, but this generation had forgotten. No one had prepared. No one had volunteered. So the scarecrows would take what they were owed. The whole town. Everyone who'd benefited from the protection without paying the price. I looked at Jake, saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. Sarah, no, one life or hundreds. I whispered, that's the agreement. Then I'll do it, not you. It has to be someone who understands, who chooses with full knowledge. I held up the journal. I'm the only one who's read it all, who truly knows. The scarecrows watched, waited. Their breathing had resumed, faster now, hungry. And then I laughed. Actually laughed, because I'd been so focused on the horror, I'd missed the obvious. No, I said, loud and clear. No deal. The agreement is broken. The scarecrows shifted. Agitated, old Jim leaned forward. You cannot break what was sealed in blood and corn. I can't, I admitted. But you already did, the moment you moved, the moment you revealed yourselves. The agreement was for protection in exchange for ignorance. For the town never knowing what really watched over their fields. But now we know. Now everyone knows. The breathing stopped. The corn fell silent. The protection is broken. I continued, feeling more certain with each word. You showed yourselves, broke the mystery. And without the mystery, without the fear of the unknown, you're just straw and old clothes, nothing more. Old Jim's oil-slick eyes narrowed. You think you're clever, but come next harvest moon, there won't be a next time. I pulled out Jake's lighter, because now we know what you are and what you aren't. You're not protectors. You're parasites, feeding on our fear, our superstition. Well, the scarecrow days are over. I lit the journal, threw it at old Jim's feet. The effect was immediate. Fire spread from scarecrow to scarecrow, but not normal fire. This burned cold, blue-white, consuming not just straw and fabric but something deeper, the thing that had animated them, given them hunger and purpose. They screamed as they burned, not with voices, but with the sound of winter wind, of empty fields, of failed harvests, and in that screaming, I heard the truth. They hadn't been protecting us. They'd been farming us, generation after generation, cultivating our fear, our offerings, our belief, until they were strong enough for the real harvest. But belief works both ways, and disbelief, understanding, knowledge, those are powerful too. By dawn, nothing remained but ash. Mr. Henderson had collapsed when the first scarecrow burned, but he was alive, traumatized but alive. The corn stood silent and still, just corn, nothing more. The town came back slowly. Some people claimed gas leak hallucinations, mass hysteria, elaborate Halloween prank. Fine, let them believe what they need to. But I know some of you watching this understand. Some of you have seen your scarecrows move, noticed things that shouldn't be. So here's my advice. Next time you set up that festive fall scarecrow, look closer. Check for symbols carved where they shouldn't be. Watch for movement. Listen for breathing. And if your scarecrows start to move, don't wait, don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Burn them. Burn them all, before they remember what they really are. Jake and I still live in Millbrook. We helped establish a new town tradition. Every Halloween, we gather all the scarecrows and have a big bonfire. Call it the Harvest Festival. People think it's quaint, charming even. They don't know we're keeping watch, making sure nothing takes root, nothing grows in the spaces between fear and faith. Because now I know the truth. It wasn't just Millbrook. This happens everywhere. Different forms, different agreements, different prices. So I'm curious. Have any of you noticed something off about your decorations? Your traditions? That mannequin in the store window that seems to shift positions? The garden gnomes that face different directions each morning? Drop a comment below. Share your story. Because the more we share, the more we know. And knowledge, real knowledge, that's the only protection we really have. And hey, if this story kept you up, made you think, made you check your window, consider subscribing, because this isn't the only secret Millbrook was hiding. And Halloween may be over, but Christmas is coming, and you wouldn't believe what I discovered about our town's antique nativity scene. But that's a story for next time. Sweet dreams.